We're going to be looking at the role of personality, temperament, and the different types of stress modulation that individuals can have, and why some individuals actually um, uh, perceive stress more than another, even all other things being equal. In chapter 13, we talked about those different variables that can modulate the perception of stress. If you recall, outlet for frustration, belief that one has control, and so on. But now we're going to look at how individuals differ in terms of coping with stress or perceiving stress even as a result specifically of their personality and temperament. So let's take a look at your notes here. I'm going to try to get this down and get myself up here a little bit and go from here. I sometimes try to do this ahead of time, but it doesn't always work quite the way I want. Okay, so as Sapolsky says in his book, psychological factors can modulate the stress response. And those are what I was just talking about. Perceive yourself in a given situation to have outlets, expressive outlets, meaning an outlet for frustration and others. Not that that's the only outlet you might have. Hopefully we find better ways of having an outlet than going and beating somebody else or, something like that. Belief that you have control, predictive information, those things are important in terms of helping you to have a lower stress response. But having said that, people do differ in how they modulate their stress responses with psychological variables. And I'm actually going to do something I don't do very often, as most of you know by now. I'm going to read something directly from the Sapolsky book. And the first is the profile of Gary, who is in his prime age, like, that age where you've achieved this much, you've gotten to this point, you've matured, hopefully. And things are pretty stable, pretty good. Okay, so, and he's number 2 in the dominance hierarchy, important fact. Okay, here we go. Consider Gary. In the prime of his life, he is, by most estimates, a success. He's done okay for himself materially, and he never even comes close to going hungry. He's also had more than his share of sexual partners. And he has done extremely well in the hierarchical world that dominates most of his waking hours. He's good at what he does, and what he does is compete. He's already number 2, and he's breathing down the neck of number 1, who's grown complacent and, a little bit slack, so now's the time to hit, right? Things are good and likely to get better, but you wouldn't call Gary satisfied. In fact, he never really has been. Everything is a battle to him. You know people like that? The mere appearance of a rival rockets him into a tensely agitated state. And he views every interaction with a potential competitor as an in-your-face personal provocation. Wow. I think, yeah, we see people like that. He views virtually every interaction with a distrustful vigilance. And not surprisingly, Gary has no friends to speak of. His subordinates give him a wide, fearful berth because of this tendency to take out his frustrations on them. And he behaves the same towards Kathleen, and barely knows their daughter, Caitlin. This is the sort of guy who is completely indifferent to the cutest of infants. How can he be? And when he looks at all he's accomplished, all he can think of is he's not number 1. Okay, so Gary's profile comes with some physiological correlates: elevated basal cortisol levels, a constant low grade stress response because life is one big stressor for him, elevated resting blood pressure, an unhealthy ratio of good to bad cholesterol, and already the early stages of serious atherosclerosis, an immune system that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And looking ahead, a premature death in his late middle age. Not good, okay? That basal glucocorticoid level all the time. Remember what's happening with glucocorticoids and brain structures such as the hippocampus and immune system organs. Hopefully all of those things that we've learned so far make sense in terms of not looking good for Gary. Okay. Now we're going to contrast Gary's profile with Kenneth. He's also prime age and number 2 in his world, but he got there through a different route, one reflecting the different approach to life that he's had ever since he was a kid. Someone caustic or jaded may dismiss him as just being a politician, but he's actually basically a good guy. He works well with others, comes to their aid, and they in turn to his. Social support. Consensus builder, team player. I like this guy. And if he's ever frustrated about anything, and it isn't all that certain he ever is, he certainly doesn't take it out on those around him. A few years ago, Kenneth was poised for a move to the number 1 position, but he did something extraordinary. He walked away from it all. Times were good enough that he wasn't going to starve, and he had reached the realization that there were things in life more important than fighting your way up the hierarchy. So he's spending time with his kids, Sam and Alan, making sure they grow up safe and healthy. He has a best friend in their mother, Barbara, and never gives a thought to what he's turned his back on. Regret, right? No regret. Not surprisingly, Kenneth has a physiological profile quite different from Gary's. Basically, the opposite on every stress-related measure. And he enjoys robust, good health. He is destined to live to a ripe old age with Barbara and his kids and his grandkids. Normally, with these sorts of profiles, you try to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. But guess what? We have pictures of them right in your Sapolsky book. So, in case you don't have it, right there, I'm putting it up. You see Kenneth, and you see Gary, very different. Gary, grumpy Gary, and cute, cuddly Kenneth. That I know starts with C. Okay, anyway. So there's not so much different, really, between these primates and us. So let's take a look at the differences in these individuals that do map on to us. Differences in perception. I've got a good look at, this is nice, and I gotta get here. Or every person who comes to you, it's like, oh, you know, a little confrontation. Yeah, you know those people. I know you do. Or the, oh, okay, you know, this really isn't a big enough battle to worry about. Have, you know, it's not that big of a deal. And coping skills. Sapolsky studies on the Serengeti really yielded so much data and allowed us to understand more of this than one would ever be able to get initially from human populations in many ways. But I want to say right at the outset that it's tough to control for experimental design anything out in the wild on the Serengeti. Tough in controls. So the way observations are going to occur are different. And trust me, when it's in the wild, when it's naturalistic observation, you are not controlling which animal gets stressed, which animal is going to not get stressed, what those stressors are going to be. So it is up to the group that you are actually observing to do what they do, and then you get information from that. So what Sapolsky observed is the first variable that's huge, and this is a personality type of a thing, is the difference between one who is gets an appropriate interpretation versus a hot responder. You know, everything should not be, he's against me, he's trying to get the best of me, and blah, 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 blah. And we know that happens. So that takes a toll on the individual who is responding in that way. The hot responder is hurting him or herself. Variable number 2, taking control versus passivity makes a difference. Variable 3, can you accurately respond to the outcome of the situation? And variable 4, what is the response after the defeat? And this is a quote from Sapolsky's book: males who beat up on someone else have lower glucocorticoid levels. So that's the response. Now, again, remember, this is in the baboon world. We should hopefully have ways to reduce our glucocorticoid levels after a defeat than beating somebody else up. There are other ways that we can do that, and hopefully we employ those. After factoring out the rank, Sapolsky found that lower basal glucocorticoid levels are found in the males who are best at 1, telling the difference between threatening and neutral interactions. And that folds into the predictability component, okay? Now, and as we saw and talked about just a moment ago, some people interpret everything as being threatening, okay? Second, these glucocorticoid levels were lower in males that were able to take the initiative in threatening situations or social control. Now, that does not mean necessarily being the aggressor. It means doing something to avoid a full-out confrontation, if you will. Also, those males who are best at telling whether they won or lost. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, well, duh, right? You don't know if you lost, you don't know if you won. You would be surprised at how someone may not be able to interpret that correctly. It's like, get the message. And so cognitive appraisal is playing a role in various places throughout these processes. For example, cognitive appraisal actually is important in the telling the difference between threatening and neutral interaction, right? And now it's like, you better figure out whether you won or lost. And the fourth component here that Sapolsky points out is the males have lower glucocorticoid levels if they are good at making someone else pay if they suffer a defeat or outlet for frustration. And again, as I said before, let's hope that we don't necessarily have to go beat somebody up or bite them like a rat would or whatever to have that outlet for frustration. We have many other means of releasing our frustration. And so another important predictor, I love this. I just, I love this. It's some of you know from when we actually were in classroom, that I said how much I love animals. I love watching them. I love knowing what, how they care for their young and stuff like that. However, I can't stand seeing a lion run down a baby wildebeest and have breakfast. And therefore, I knew from a very early age I was not going to be able to go out and do naturalistic observation, because I would be like running, going, "Here, lion, here, oh, here's a steak. Don't you want the steak? You don't even have to work hard at it. Run, baby wildebeest, run, baby wildebeest." But this is not good for really understanding what goes on. So it's like, so guess what? This is not what you do. So anyway, so as you're watching this naturally organized social group, that social affiliation makes a difference. Patterns of social affiliation associated with lower basal glucocorticoids include grooming others and being groomed, playing with young, and this means the males, this doesn't mean just the females, capable of developing friendships. So keep competition in perspective and establish a strong social system. Very important ways in which we can bring our low basal glucocorticoids down. All right. The human realm, let's move to that. And I've tried to draw very specific, connections or correlations between both baboon and human. Early psychoanalytic theories link certain personality types with a variety of psychological pathologies. Now, before I even say this, as this has not been demonstrated to be true. Okay, do you remember good old Freud? Good old Freud. Freud came up with some interesting theories that have since not been shown to be true. In fact, have been shown to be not true. And some of them I felt were kind of disturbing. However, the good side of it is, out of that grew the scientific field of psychology. And never forget that ultimately it's a psychological science. Okay. Now, in earlier, it was like, okay, if you have a certain personality type, you have colitis. Not that stress can't make colitis worse. You have psychogenic abortion, that's a miscarriage, and so forth. And I mean, remember things like, the reason you are constipated is because you don't want to give up what you're containing to this porcelain pony, because early in your childhood somebody made you do that way before you should have, and then it goes into your adulthood as colitis. No. It's not true. Okay. And there were a lot of studies that followed in Freud's footsteps, trying to say these things actually do fit together, but they had the inherent problems that all respective studies do. And there needs to be more predictive studies if we are going to actually connect some of these. Now, having said that, there are definitely components, not necessarily Freudian theory per se, but where early stress, early trauma, even during fetal life, can set one up for long-term, as we noted before, physiological changes. The difference is that's not because a person has this personality. It's like, oh, you know, it's there's a connection. It just isn't the same as in the very early days of psychology it might have been perceived. At least that is my belief, and I think my belief is based on a fair amount of scientific research and scientific documentation, if you will. So, and again, if you've ever taken childhood mental disorders with me, or will in the spring, you will see how those factors fit together. Anyway, I need to move on. Psychiatric disorders and abnormal stress responses. 1/2 of people who have been diagnosed with clinical depression have elevated resting glucocorticoid levels. Okay, some are unable to turn off glucocorticoid secretion. Their brains just are less sensitive to the shut-off signal. Reminder, that means their negative feedback mechanism is not functioning appropriately. And in learned helplessness, which we will talk about in the depression lecture, no coping response is even attempted. It's like, I give up, whatever, I just give up. So with anxiety disorders, we have the situation of, okay, when am I safe? What are the rules for being safe? And if you don't know that, for whatever reason, elevated glucocorticoid levels. There's, because I've taken up a fair amount of time with some other little narratives in this lecture, I'm going to let you take a look at the dog, tone, and shock example in your Sapolsky book. So I'll move right on to, with anxiety, you are still typically trying to have a coping response. You're attempting a coping response. The discrepancy is for these individuals, and some of you may know exactly what I'm talking about, stressors are everywhere and they're perpetual. So you must have constant mobilization of coping responses. That is exhausting. Exhausting. Okay? So type A personality. For a long time, that's what we heard, type A, type B. And there was this, it kind of evolved the Sisyphus pattern. Some of you may remember, like in the Greek literature, or maybe you won't, about Sisyphus, who his punishment, so to speak, real short, was he had to roll this huge rock up a hill, then it rolled down, then he had to go up again, and down. And joyless struggle. And when we take a look at personality and cardiovascular physiology, we find that certain components of the type A put those individuals at special risk for sudden cardiac arrest and other types of cardiovascular problems. Okay, now I have in here defining the type A personality, and this is really, really, really important. Initially, it was like, okay, you are fairly competitive, you're a perfectionist, you want things done right, you want to be on time for things, you're particularly careful about how you do things and organize things because it's important to you that they're right. You are temperamental, you are go, 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 go all the time, and you can't turn it off, which in some cases make people like hard to be around, okay? But those particular characteristics of type A personality have been refined, and there are subcategories. And I remember I used to think about this myself because I was one of those people from an early age that I mean, maybe you could say overachiever, because if I had an assignment, man, I had to go over the top like 5 million times. If I, you know, it's something, but I never saw myself as an angry, horrible person who didn't like being around other people and who had no friends. And so I'm like, wait a minute, I can't be type A because I don't want to be this person. But as I said a minute ago, there are subcategories. This is not the course to go into this, but the once they started going, oh, this person that we've classified as type A doesn't have cardiovascular issues, whereas this person does. Contradictory findings. Well, by the fine tuning that I mentioned, it was eventually discovered that hostility is the only significant predictor of heart disease and overall increases in mortality across all diseases. So it's the hostility part. So you can be that, oh, I really want this done right. I need to do this on time. I've got to look at my schedule, blah, 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 blah. You can be all of those, but not hostile all the time. So that's just really, it's kind of important to me that people see the differences. And next, we're going to talk a little bit about, oops, I'm just trying to tidy this up as I go through. How hostility hurts your heart. Now, how is it? We just said that hostility actually is the significant factor, right? Hostile persons are those who get worked up and angry over incidents that the rest of us would find only mildly provocative, if provocative at all. Think about Gary versus Kenneth. Remember, Gary is like, everything is like, oh my gosh, this is a hostile overtaking. But if it is social situations, and this I find very interesting as well, that initiate the stress response in hostile persons. More and more epinephrine and norepinephrine get dumped into their bloodstreams, which elevates blood pressure, right? Remember that from, and that's important while you're running from the bear. But you shouldn't be running from a bear 24/7. Okay, and life, this is Sapolsky, I put in quotes, I'm not trying to take credit for this. Life hammers away at the heart of these individuals. Okay, so how was type A personality actually even discovered in the first place? Dr. Meyer Friedman was a cardiologist, and he, you know, and his colleagues had a very successful practice, but they were spending a fortune on having the chairs in their waiting room reupholstered. The frontmost few inches of the seat cushion and armrest were worn to shreds. Like, now think about it, what you're doing. And this is a little bit, I'm always sitting at the edge of my seat. And even in a restaurant, I have to remember to pull my seat in once I actually start going to restaurants much again, because I tend to literally sit on the end of my seat, edge of my seat. But what they did, they talked to, you know, here's a doctor's convention, and you have, gastroenterologists, and you have other types, pediatricians, you get, well, that's probably not a good example. Other types of doctors, and Dr. Friedman's going, oh my gosh, do you know a good place to get upholstery done because I'm spending a fortune? They're like, why? And he's like, whoa, doesn't this happen? Aren't all your chairs like worn out at the edges? They're like, no. And that's when it was, the people who were winding up in the cardiologist's office tended to have something different in terms of personality in many cases. One of these things perhaps was time pressuredness. It's like, oh my gosh, we all get anxious, right, when it's taken a while. But that constant, like, okay, got to do this, got to get there. So to kind of wrap this up, hopefully here. I need to move you. Go, 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 go. Don't fail me now, computer. All right. As some of you have heard of the Martha Stewart's disease, and that's kind of goes along with this type A personality, but it's the repressive personalities. And repressive personalities who actually, they're chronically activated stress responses, but they're not being overtly demonstrated. And some of you may not know much about Martha Stewart. She's been around for a long time, you know, the home person, the cooking in here. And I remember seeing her occasionally, very occasionally, and I was just absolutely amazed by her flat affect and her very, very monotone delivery. And it's like, okay, and this is what we're going, blah, blah, blah. And then we add this. And now here is the finished product. It's so good. It's like, okay, your excitement is a little low key. And then some of you may have heard of this, probably most of you not. At one point, she was so angry with her husband, she took her car and drove it in through the wall of their home. Oh, repressed. And she did some other things that were not exactly appropriate. So, repressive personalities. And that kind of is where I'm going to end today. This is the end of this chapter. It's, I think, a brief, kind of a nice snapshot that gives you information and hopefully makes sense. And I will be seeing you next time with depression, with a chapter on depression. Okay.